because I don't want to suffer any more emotional pain, any more relational pain. So let me just stay away from the two main things that people do: get married and have kids. So I had decided on a life of just being alone. Now, I would have friends and I would, encounter people, but I had decided that I didn't want that. And with those decisions, now that I look back, I set myself up to be confined in a prison of my own making. You're listening to the Experience Freedom Podcast. I'm your host, Ajene Gaylord, and I endeavor to educate, encourage, and empower women to embrace emotional healing and eradicate the stigma of mental health in the body of Christ. On this episode, we continue in our Freedom series. Today, you get to hear a little more about my origin story, some of the experiences that I had, the mistakes that I made, the perspectives that I've had to change, and where I am today. So stay tuned. I think I want to start with just sharing a little bit of my own story. And I'm not sure which part to begin with, because I think that I have been on this journey of healing, it feels like all my life, at least as far as being more aware of the need to overcome or to heal from pain and wounds and traumas that have occurred in my life. And so much of my story, from as far back as I can remember, had everything to do with how I grew up, what happened in my household when I was a child, and then the impact, the fallout, the residue of that most of my life. I can look back to as early as my college days. I hit the college campus when I was 17 years old and wanting with everything in my being to escape my home life. Now that I'm older and I have gone through many different phases of healing emotionally and physically, I look back from a different lens. And so I'll talk about that on another show. But just pulling up and remembering all the ways that I looked at and focused on the pain, focused on the wounds, focused on the hurt. Not to say that it wasn't important at the time, not to say that I should diminish any of my story at all, but I'm in a different place now. But when I remember looking back from places where I was still very, very broken and very much aware of the wounds, I could not find any redemptive nature in what I was experiencing. It was very, very difficult for me to appreciate the people in my life, my parents. And even though my father was not in the home once I reached a certain age, he left, my parents divorced. He was no longer actively raising me. The imprint of him having been there for the period of time that he was, I think it was about to my age 7 for me, around that age. I'm not quite sure, but I think around age 7 or 8 is when he left. And I recall the imprint of that wound of rejection that I felt, that wound of abandonment that I felt, was what was so prevalent and in my face most of my days, most of my experiences. I recall, because there was some physical abuse that I incurred at his hands prior to that, those are some of the more lasting and vivid memories that I have of him. I have others, which the older I get and the more I heal, I look back and can't remember some very pleasant things. One of those things is a dish that he used to make, because I'm a foodie. My first word was eat. I love to eat. I love food. And so most of my childhood memories that are positive are around food. So one of those memories is this dish that he used to make that had ground beef and potatoes and cheese, which is one of my favorite food items of all time, is cheese. And I remember being really, really small because he was super tall in my eyes. I think he's about six something in height. And so, of course, being a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, he seemed like a giant to me. And I remember him standing at the stove with a cast iron skillet, cooking up the ground beef, putting the potatoes in, covering it with the cheese. And it was one of the favorite things I can remember about him, the image that I have of him, and a dish that I really enjoy eating. But that memory, I had it, but it was overshadowed by the memories of the pain, the memories of the hurt, the memories of the quote unquote bad things that happened to me. Those things shine brighter than any of the other memories and experiences that I had. And I spent most of my life rehearsing those or reminiscing on those or recalling those or trying to overcome the pain of those. And that's not freedom. That's not being free. That's not being without. I was bound and constrained and imprisoned by those thoughts and memories. And they were real. My emotional life took an impact because I did not have joy. I had joyful moments, getting married, having my children, getting my first job, making my first big paycheck, buying a car. Like I had joyful moments, but I don't recall ever being in a state of having joy. I don't recall lasting happiness, lasting joy, lasting peace. I recall, and this is before we knew or had terminology in the way that we do today, anxiety, fear, being overwhelmed by thoughts of worry and what ifs. That's a very simplistic definition of anxiety, but that's really what it is being consumed by all the what ifs. What if this could happen, or the worries and cares of what could occur. So a lot of what I spent my energy on emotionally, mentally, even though I was achieving things to try to escape my circumstances, when I hit the college campus, it was all about trying to get rid of my past, move on, run away in a way that would allow for me to create my own future. And I wanted all the control. I didn't want to trust anyone else. I didn't want to have to depend on anyone else. And I used academic achievement as a way to escape what I felt was, a very challenging childhood. And again, I share this from that was the place of brokenness that I was coming from. And it wasn't all bad. Yes, I had some not so great moments. Yes, I was a product of divorce. I was a product of a single parent household. I was a product of welfare and poverty. I was a product of domestic violence. My father, although we did not encounter him during this time, was an addict, and he was on the street, and he had his own story about what it was for him to endure addiction. I was a product of a family history of sexual molestation and abuse of all types. So yes, this was a part of my history and a part of my story and a part of my family of origin. But at the same time, there were all these other blessings and benefits that I received by being a part of my family. One of those is to be introduced to Christ. My grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, my aunts, they had a relationship with the Lord. They took us to church. They introduced us to this concept. And I, through that exposure, was able to receive Christ and have a foundation all of my life in a faith-based way. And so as much as I understand that a lot of my story was framed around the trauma and the pain and the wounds and the abuse, there's so much more to my story than that. And so at the time, I acted out based on the pain and the realities of what I was enduring, and that was my way of fixing it, stopping it, ending it, was to get out of there, leave Detroit, go as far away as I could, and it just never return. And that was my thought, is that that's what I would do. I would go away to school, and although initially when I first got away at school, I didn't think I would never come back to Detroit. It wasn't until a few years later that I made that decision. And I decided I'll never come back to Detroit. I don't ever want to go back home. It was so bad that I traveled with our concert choir. That was one of the organizations I was a part of. I love to sing. And so I got a music scholarship along with my academic scholarship. And we would come and we would travel all over the US and go to different places. And Detroit was one of our stops. We would always come to the towns where, or the cities where we had alumni, and the alumni would host us. And so we had a large alumni association here in Detroit. As a matter of fact, one of the women who was a part of it went to my home church that I grew up at. So very familiar with that, and love to return. When we would come to any host city, the students who lived in that city would host the choir members. And when, of course, they would stay at your home with your family, you would open up your home. And then when we would go to cities that we didn't have a lot of host families, we would stay at hotels. So it was a way to kind of help the students to afford it. The college and the music department covered the cost, but you got to see your family. I mean, you're here. Usually we would go during spring break. So most of the time your family was around, your friends were around, and you would come home. We would do the concert, but you would stay with the family members. When I would come to Detroit, I would not stay at my house where my mother and my sisters were. I would stay at a friend's. And that was not what you did. And I know that I hurt my mother in doing that. And I have since apologized for that. But at the time, I'm 17, 18, 19, I'm just reacting in my own pain, right? And I recognized that I was fighting so hard for something, and I didn't even really know what it was. And I was fighting for it in the wrong way. And that in and of itself was bondage. I didn't see it as that at the time. I didn't recognize it as constraint. I didn't recognize it as not being free, but that's exactly what it was. I wasn't free to make choices out of a place of feeling like I had a right to act or speak or think, or without hindrance or without that restraint. I was making these decisions from a bondage to pain. And honestly, didn't even realize that until in the last few years of my journey. So to fast forward a little bit, and I'll share more of my college years one day, but to fast forward through that, there were several things that I promised myself as a little girl, or at least the beliefs that I had placed in my mind, which was other ways that I imprisoned myself, which was one was I would never be poor again. I did not like the feeling of lacking. I did not like the feeling of not having enough. I didn't like the struggle. And I promised the little girl in me that I would never be without, and I would never be poor, and I would never lack. And that's partly why my academic pursuit was the way it was. I saw academics as a way to earn income, as a way to escape poverty and welfare. And although in my later teenage years growing up, my mother was able to become employed, she kind of bucked against the system, chose education instead of staying on welfare. She obtained her master's degree. She went on to a wonderful teaching career, and she was able to overcome that. It was still embedded in me as a young girl that this life is not for me. So I decided and promised myself I would never, ever, ever be in poverty. And the other things that were not necessarily promises, but this is more like some guarantees, or at least things that I did not want as a result of my own pain. One was I did not want to get married, and I did not want to have children. I looked at family as dysfunction. I looked at family as hurt, as destruction. And I didn't want to, number one, mess up anybody else's life. So I didn't want to have children. And I didn't want to have to struggle with the commitment of marriage by having to submit and surrender and to compromise and all those things. I didn't see a healthy marriage growing up. And so I made these decisions. So one was a promise to the little girl in me that I would never find myself in a poverty condition. And then the other was like, here's what I'm not going to do, because I don't want to suffer any more emotional pain, any more relational pain. So let me just stay away from the two main things that people do: get married and have kids. So I was going to have this wonderful career where I was going to travel the world and make all this money and just have my own life and be alone. I had decided on a life of just being alone. Now, I would have friends and I would, encounter people, but I had decided that I didn't want that. And with those decisions, now that I look back, I set myself up to be confined in a prison of my own making. I allowed the things that happened to me to then cause me to decide what I wouldn't do, and then to prevent the very opportunities to be healed, to be blessed, to be made whole by deciding that what I didn't want as far as family or relationship was somehow protecting me.
I'm trying to think. I feel like a question came in my mind as far as I wanted all the control, like this, the idea
Mm-hmm.
of thinking you're free, like control equals freedom somehow. That,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, if I make the right decisions, then I'll have the kind of life that I want, not realizing that wasn't even the life you wanted, or that that was just a protection mechanism, you know,
Mm-hmm.
again, protecting from the pain and such.
Yeah, it wasn't the life that I wanted or that the Lord wanted for me, but in my mind, this was going to keep me from pain and keep me from hurt and keep me from disappointment and keep me from letting someone else down. Not even just me being let down or hurt or rehearsing those childhood experiences, but also not ruining the life of my children or damaging someone else. So this was a way for me to keep myself from any further harm, right? Any further wounds, any further abandonment or rejection. If I can stay away from relationship, especially the closest that you can have, which is to choose a spouse and to bear children, then I can keep myself from any more pain, right? And I think about the fact that there are different layers to freedom, at least from how I want to explain it. And one of them is belief. And I was in bondage to belief. I had these ideas and concepts and made meaning of my experiences and told myself, here's how it's going to be. And it took many, many years of maturity, growing up, relationship with God, um, growing in my faith, studying the word, prayer, counseling, and being in relationship to help to overcome some of those hurdles initially. But most of my young adult life, so this would be, once I passed the adolescence, teenage years, and into my early 30s, I spent most of those years trying to get over the hurt. And those were the years that I suffered the most with my physical health. At the time, I really didn't make the connection. I kind of had a little bit of a idea because of the work that I do. But I didn't fully understand how much my emotional health was impacting my physical health at the time. I had not yet looked at the brain body connection as far as trauma and healing. I had not yet fully understood how what happens in your soul happens in your cells. I heard someone say that in a book that I read a couple years ago, and that concept kind of jumped out at me, and I was like, wait, what does that mean? And I began to look into that. So much of what I spent my time doing was, I'm thinking I'm free. I'm thinking that I'm able to make these choices. I'm going off to college. I'm going to get this career. I'm not going to, get married. I'm not going to have children. To me, that was freedom. I got to decide. That's what I told myself freedom was. I had no idea what it meant not to be free or what that looked like. And what it took for me was years and years and years of living in a way that just didn't quite seem like this is how it's supposed to be. It's hard to really put it in words and explain what that means, But there was just this lull in my life where, like I said, I wasn't really joyful or happy, things that you would think would bring more excitement. I wasn't excited. I didn't respond in a typical way to things in my life that seemed like they would be joyful. So it took me examining that. It took other people pointing it out. So I'm going to stop here and pick up the rest of the story and more of my revelations on the next part in the series. But before you go, I want you to consider the life work for this episode. Try and retell your origin story. Remember way back in one of our beginning episodes, I asked you to write out your origin story, to examine the origins of your life and what happened as you were growing up. And as I've shared today, I want you to consider a new perspective, maybe from a place of joy, healing, grace, and forgiveness, and retell your origin story from there. So stay tuned and we'll see you on the next one. That's it for this episode. If you have been enjoying listening, please consider sharing and subscribing to the podcast. And until next time, remember, you have been set free to live free, so choose freedom.